Good Tavach, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for the learning of Torah Hashem as Hashem Yisbarach. We are sponsored by Shalom Fogel, Nishmis Yaakov Zeb ben Yehuda Arya, Rivka Bas Yaakov Yosef, Tzivya Miriam Bas Gad, Yosef ben Sion ben Yaakov Zev, by A.B. Spry for Nachas from children and grandchildren, by Baruch Ian, Walidei Nishmas Yaakov Chaim ben Abba, Esther Bas Gittel, Abraham ben Shmuel HaKayin, by Yaakov Yamansky from Hakos HaTov to Rav and the Zoom family, and Nachas from children and grandchildren, by Ed Salah from London and Joshua Rosenberg, a virtual Talmud. A good Tavach, all wonderful people. As we welcome in A.B. Spry, we welcome in Saba, we welcome in Aaron Swade, we welcome in Michael and Stephen Holtzman. Shalom Fogel, it's good to have you on a Motzei Shabbos, Shalom. And Menachem Yamansky, Nachman Chapler, Dr. Guy, Mordechai Sultan, it's good to have you. Yitzi Fuchs, we have Shelley Zeitlin, Irving Fishbaum, Mo Kushner, Marshall Castle, Mark Frankel, Rabbi Kranz, Bruce Eisenberg. We have Moshe Lehman, Ilya Shutman, Chaim Braun, Yitzi Muller, Naftali Jablin. Here in the shul, we have Barish Gesseman, we have Michal Avram, we have Arnold Avram Schenkman, we have Reb Yitzchak Rosenberg, Reb Pesach Rosenberg, and Ruvain Shanet. David Helfgott is joining us on Karl Halashin, and we are holding by Tajma 4 lines from the bottom of Daf Tzadik Daled Amud Beis. Just to point out that on the last Motzei Shabbos of the year, we learn to be Mekayim the mitzvah v'dibarta bam la'asais nachas ruach liyotzreinu, telling Hashem that this is what we want to do with our time for the whole year. It should be untroubled and healthy and gesund. We are discussing Rav Huna's halacha. Rav Huna's halacha said that although we allow impurities of a Raiva Kav, but if Mark checks what Marshall sells him and finds that there is more impurities, then he could sift out all the impurities, even what was formerly allowed. Because if Marshall is acting like Marshall, so we make him pay everything. So we're continuing to bombard this halacha of Rav Huna, 4 lines from the bottom of Tzadik Daled Amud Beis. Tajma, the Tani Rabban Bar Rav Nachman, Lo Yasam Moiser Bilvadhu Maser. The din is when Marshall sells Mark a kur, that's 30 sah. He sells him a lot of land, a kur, 30 sah, acreage of 30 sah. If there is extra, a roiva hakav, that's a quarter of a kav, a quarter of a kav, a sah is 6 kav. If there's extra rova hakav for each sah, so that's 1/24 of each sah, so either extra or less, Mark has to accept the deal. More than that, if let's say there was more than a quarter of a kav extra per sah in the 30 sah, then Mark has to return it to Marshall. The Tani Rabban Bar Rav Nachman Lo Yasam Moiser Bilvadhu Maser, then he doesn't return to Marshall just the excess. Ela Mazel is Kala Ravan Kulan. He has to return everything, even the allowable quarter of a kav per sah. So Al Maheicha Debayadure, we seem to be able to conclude from here that where you have to return it, Kulamad, you return everything. So that's a raya to Rav Huna, that if there is, Marshall is caught having passed on to Mark more impurities, right? So he has to remove all the impurities. So the Gemara says, Hachi Ashta, what's the comparison? Hasam, over there in the case where Marshall sold the mark to mark the curve, Hein Chaser, Hein Yeser Amalei. He told him it's 30 curve, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. Miu Revia Loichoshev. A quarter of a calf per saw is not considered important, and therefore that Marshall is Michael. Yes, a Meravia, but if it's more than a quarter of a calf per saw, then the surplus, when you total it up amongst the 30 saw, comes to a minimum field of its own. Yes, in Ravia Choshev, the cave in the Chazile, it's the Rufe Betisha Kavian, because since if you put together all those quarter of a calves, more than a quarter of a calf, over 30 saw, it comes to a minimal field of 9 calf. Marshall is not going to look away from a what is considered a field. Havila Arach Hashivusa Bape Nafsha. That's a land that's important by itself, Bahadra, and that Marshall wants. But in this case, Mark is willing to accept impurities of up to a Roivakah because that's normal. So now the Gemara says 4 lines from the top of Daf Tzadikei Amud Aleph Toshma, Ha'ina, overcharging, something that Marshall is very good at. Ha'ina, overcharging. Pachas Mishtos, if he overcharged Mark less than a 6, Niknamet, the sale goes through. Yoisim Mishtos, if it's more than a 6, Batalmek, the sale is voided. Shtos, if he overcharged him a 6, Kana, the deal goes through, but Umazer Aina, Marshall has to return him the 6. Now, why does Marshall have to return him the whole 6? Return to him up to less than a 6. Since less than a 6 the sale would go through, so why does he have to return him the full 6 overture? Let him just return it until it's less than a 6. Amai lahader ad pochas mishtos. He should return it until less than a 6. So Shmamina, we should be able to extrapolate from this that kol heichad debai ladure, where you have to return kula mahader, which is exactly what Rav Huna said, that where it's the impurities are more than a quarter of a calf, he has to return everything. So the Gemara says, no, it's again not analogous. Hachi Ashta. Hasam, in the case of the business deal between Marshall and Mark, may karish shava b'shava. Mark is expecting fair pricing. May karish shava b'shava amalei. Mio pachis mishtos, if it's a differential of less than a 6, lo yedia b'mana, this is not discernible in a deal of a mana, umeichel inish, and therefore Mark is meichel. But if it's a shtus, but if it's a 6 yedia, it's discernible, and therefore v'loy meichel inish, he's not meichel anything. That's why he has to return him the whole 6. Yes, if it's more than a 6, then if Mark wants the sale voided. Mekach tasu batal mekach. Here, however, in the case of the impurities, it could very well be that Mark is willing to accept a quarter of a kab of impurities. Tajma, makabel sada mechaveiroi. Here, what happens is Marshall accepts a field he's contracted. Why Mark would contract him? Well, maybe it was Purim, and Mark was drunk. But Tajma, if Mark contracts Marshall to plant for him trees, the din is harizem mekabel of eser buryas lameya. Mark has to accept 10 barren trees per 100. In other words, if a tree doesn't produce, he has to accept 10 duds per 100. But Yosim Mekan, if it's 11 trees, then Megalgal Avesakol. Then Marshall has to replant for him all 11 trees. So the Gemara says, so you see clearly like Rav Huna, that when there's an overture, you have to refund everything. Says Gemara, that's different. Because if it's anything more than 10 trees, it's considered like a field of trees. And there's no way that Mark is going to be Meichel a field of trees. Anything more than 10 trees, it's like planting a field of trees. And planting a field of trees, Mark is not going to be Meichel an entire field of trees. Again, in our case over here, it could be that the amount of legumes or the amount of dirt and pebbles of a quarter of a calf, Mark could always be Meichel that. And therefore, it's no raya, and Gemara ends off this sugya with not bringing a proof either way to whether we say like Rav Huna or not. Now, I told you when making a deal, and we welcome in Sandy Grunfeld, and it's nice to have with us Avi and Dei Barbach and Moshe Lehman, as everybody is arriving now, and we know that in a business deal, one word counts. The fine print is extremely important. As we're going to see now, one two-letter word could make a huge difference, like zeh or lemikpeh. These all make a very big difference. Let's see it inside. Now, remember we learned in the Mishnah that if Marshall sells to Mark wine, so Mark has to accept from Marshall, out of 100 barrels, he has to accept 10 barrels that are already turning. They already have an odor of vinegar. So the Gemara says, I'm not clear what case the Mishnah is talking about. Martiv zeshel yayin. So heichidami. What's the exact language in our Mishnah? Idamale martiv shel yayin stam. If he says, I'm selling you a wine cellar without any further elaboration, kasha. Because we'll learn that in that case, the halacha isn't that you have to allow 10 barrels. Idamale martiv zeshel yayin, it's also going to be kasha. And idamale martiv zeh, without specifying wine, it's also kasha. We're going to have a hard time pinpointing what's the case of our Mishnah that where Marshall sells to Mark 100 barrels, Mark has to accept 10 barrels that are beginning to turn. The Tanya. So now we're going to learn the rules and see why we can't figure out what case the Mishnah is talking about. The Tanya. And what a wonderful thing to do on the last Motzei Shabbos of the year. And remember, we tell Hashem with all of our feeling that this is what we want to do the rest of the new year. So give us gesund, give us yishuv adas, that we should be able to do it. The Tanya. Martav shel yayin ani meichelach. If Marshall says to Mark, a seller of wine, I am selling you. Now, a seller of wine, says the Braisa, he has to give him 100 good barrels of wine, because he said a seller of wine. Martiv zeh shel yayin ani meichelach. If he says, this seller of wine I am selling you, so this seller, it could be in this cellar he has wine that is used to be sold to be drunk immediately. And wine to be drunk immediately could begin to have an odor of vinegar, but it tastes like wine. So then if he said martiv zeh, he could give him all the barrels, are barrels that are sold in the store for immediate use. Martiv zeh, so he doesn't even say the word wine, he could give him 100 barrels of vinegar, because he just said a cellar, he didn't specify wine. It could be all vinegar. So you notice we had three different languages, and none of them are what we said in the Mishnah, that Mark has to allow Marshall to give him 10 barrels that are turning. Says the Gemara, La'olam da'amalei martav shel yayin stam. We're going to make an emendation over here. And we're going to say that our Mishnah is talking about where Marshall says, I'll sell you a cellar of wine. V'tani bereisha de braisa, and amend the reisha of the braisa. Instead of selling that he has to give him, instead of saying yayin shikula yafa, in that case he has to allow for 10 barrels that are beginning to turn. So the Gemara says, just like that, you're changing the girsa. Says the Gemara, Umi mekabel. If he tells him martav shel yayin, does Mark have to accept 10 barrels that are turning? V'tani Reb Chia. Reb Chia taught, if you sell a barrel of wine, so the Gemara says, yeah, that's different. That's one barrel. One barrel, we don't say that part of it could be sour. Shani chavius tekula chad chamru. All of it is good wine. So we don't, with one barrel, we don't say that part of it could be vinegar. But with 100 barrels, 10 barrels could be starting to turn. But the Gemara says Reb Zvid doesn't teach this way. V'atani Reb Zvid debei Reb Aishia. Reb Zvid taught in the academy of Reb Aishia. There's different Reb Zvids. This is the Reb Zvid from the academy of Reb Aishia. V'atani Reb Zvid debei Reb Aishia. Martav shel yayin ani meichelach. If he says, I'm selling you a cellar of wine, so here you see, we don't have an allowance of 10. Then, if he says martiv zeh, then he has to accept 10 barrels that are beginning to turn. V'zehu, and this is what our Mishnah is talking about. V'zehu oitzer shechshanu chachamim v'mishnah seinu. This is the seller that the chachamim taught in our Mishnah, that when he says martiv zeh shel yayin, that he has to allow for 10 barrels. But the problem is that earlier we learned martiv zeh, you could give the whole cellar that's beginning to turn, because it could be that the cellar is being sold for immediate use. Elamas nisan nami da'amalei zeh kasha. Says the Gemara, Elamas nisan nami da'amalei zeh kasha zeh zeh. Because in one place we say zeh allows for the whole martiv could be like it's sold in the chanus, where it's only good for immediate use. And here it says that you're only allowed to allow 10 barrels. So here the Gemara says, interesting. The Gemara adds a new variable. Lo kasha hada amalei lemikpa. Where do we say that most of the wine has to be good, except for 10? That's where he says that he's selling it lemikpa, for cooking. Now, for cooking, when you buy wine for cooking, since you add into the cooking only a little bit for each dish, you want that wine to last a long time. And therefore, you cannot say that all of it should be like it's sold in the store for immediate use. But since he said zeh, that allows for a 10 barrel leeway that's turning. If he didn't say lemikpeh, so then if he says martiv zeh, the whole thing could be maybe like it's sold in the store, where it's for immediate use. To Reb Zvid, that says that we only allow an allowance of 10 barrels to amalei lemikpeh. So there, most of it has to be long-lasting in order to be able to be used for cooking. Brisa deloy amalei mikvah, and the Gemara develops it further, explaining the fine print, as we welcome in Avram Sheps. Hilkach martiv shel yayin. If he says a martiv of wine, and he doesn't even say va'amalei lemikpeh, and he says also it's for cooking. Now here he doesn't say the zeh, which would give us a little bit of a leeway that maybe it could be 10 barrels that are turning. Nice and yayin shikula yafi. He has to give him wine that's all good. Martiv zeh shel yayin. If he says zeh, so zeh is limiting. Mikpeh is telling you that it has to be long lasting. So martiv zeh shel yayin v'amalei lemikpeh. So the mikveh implies long lasting. Zeh implies an allowance that some of it could be turning. Nice and yayin shikula yafa, but umekabel of eser kaisis. He has to accept 10 barrels per 100 that is turning. Martiv zeh shel yayin v'lo yamalei lemikpeh. If he says martiv zeh shel yayin doesn't say long lasting for cooking, then nice and yayin emimker b'chanus, he can give him all wine that's only good for immediate use, like it's sold in the store. Now, the Gemara says, interesting. Ibayalu martiv shel yayin v'loy amalei lemikpeh mai. Here, it says martiv shel yayin. It doesn't say zeh, but it also doesn't say lemikpeh. So what's the din over here? Ibayalu martiv shel yayin v'loy amalei lemikpeh. He doesn't say for cooking, but he also doesn't say zeh, mai. Pligi ba Rav Acha v'Ravina. It's a machlokes Rav Acha and Ravina. Chad Amar mikabel. One says he has to accept 10 barrels that are beginning to turn. The Chad Amar loy mikabel. Man Amar mikabel. You know why? Because the only time it says he doesn't have to accept it is where it says l'mikpeh. Dat mikabel daik midrab zvid. The Ktani martiv shel yayin ani moichelach nois yayin shekula yafa. He has to give all good wine, v'kimna damalei lemikvah. But that's only where he said lemikvah, time damalei lemikvah. Ha'loy amalei lemikvah, even though he didn't say zeh, mikabel, he has to accept 10 barrels that are beginning to turn. Mandi amalei mikabel daik mebraisa, the ktani martiv shel yayin amni moichelach. If it says martiv shel yayin, I'm selling you, nois and yayin shekula yafa. And there we said, "Kimna deloy amalei lemikvah." There we said it's talking about where you didn't say lemikvah. So you see that even though you didn't say lemikvah, you still have to give a martir. You have to accept all the barrels, and you don't have an allowance of 10 barrels that are turning. Ulamanda daik mid Rav Zvid, the one that makes a diak from Rav Zvid, that Rav Zvid says only if he says lemikpeh, but if he doesn't say lemikpeh, then you have to accept kasha brisa, because the brisa says that a martiv shel yayin without lemikpeh has to be kula yafa. So he says no, that brisa is a chsuri mechsura. That brisa is something's missing. V'achi ketani. Only then do you have to give all wine. You have to accept the 10 that are beginning to sell. If he says martiv zeh shel yayin and he doesn't say the mikveh, since he said martiv zeh, he has to accept only. He has to accept even all 100 that are only ready to be sold in the store, even if they're turning. The one that's daik in the brisa, that even if you don't say lemikvah, you just say martiv shel yayin, you have to give 100 good barrels of wine. Kasha to Rav Zvid, because Rav Zvid says that it's only where he said lemikvah, to kimna damalei lemikvah. Mashma lo yamalei lemikveh. If he doesn't say for cooking, he has to accept 10 mikabel. He'll learn who adin the afagav the lo yamalei lemikveh. Even if he just said matav shel yayin stam without mikveh, he cannot accept 10 barrels. Mark doesn't have to accept 10 barrels that are beginning to turn. Lo mikabel. V'haidu kimna da amalei lemikveh, and that what it says that he says lemikveh mishum de kasha zeh, because we had a stira of zeh, because we said matav zeh shel yayin, you have to accept the whole cellar that's only usable now, even though it's ready to turn. While we learned in another one where it says matav zeh shel yayin, you only have to accept 10 barrels. So there we made a chilik between the mikveh and the mikveh. Now, the Gemara is going to get easier now, Rabbi Yisai. Says the Gemara, but Mark, I would be very careful that Marshall doesn't play around. Be very careful. See if he says see if he says mikveh. Look in his eyes. Be very careful. Now,
last Masai Shabbos, I got a zap. I'm good. Then I'll have something to do tshuva for.
I don't think that's your problem. Now,
Thanks a lot. I thought I had you on my side.
I am on your side. I've been arguing with the Rebbeinu Shalom the whole year. Now, Amar Rabbi Yehuda. What bracha do you make on wine that already has an odor of vinegar but tastes like wine? That's the wine that's sold in the market, right? It's at the bar. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, yayin animker b'chanais mivarchen alav barei priagafen. You make a bracha of barei priagafen. It still tastes like wine. Rav Chisda Amar gabei chamra de akrim, wine that's already turning vinegar. Lamali, and the bracha is therefore only a shahako. So Meisvei, we learned alapas ipsha, on bread that's becoming moldy, valayayin shehikrim, and wine that's becoming vinegar, val tafshul she'ovra tzurasai, and a cooked dish that lost its normal appearance. So here, all of these things are turning. They lose its normal bracha. Rather, Aimer shahakol niya bidvara. Only make a bracha of shahakol niya bidvara. So even if it's a pasta that normally you would make a mezainis, but Marshall serves you a pasta that looks like it's creeping on the plate, if you know what I mean, right? So you make only a shahakol.
That's all the spinach I put in. It makes it look green.
Now,
Bread, it becomes what you eat, bread that's mold.
yes, in the olden days they lived on that. In the olden days they lived on it.
It's not toxic at all.
No. Now, Amar Rav Zvid, so Rav Zvid says that even though Rabbi Yehuda insists that wine that's sold in the store, in the bar, is a bar priagafen, but Meider Rabbi Yehuda bepurtsuma de mizdaven akarnasa, he agrees with the inferior wine that's sold at the street corners. In other words, in the street corners, they wouldn't be able to sell it in the bar, in a more sophisticated joint, but the wine that's really beginning to turn, that they still sell on the street corners, that Rabbi Yehuda is Meider that you make a shahakal. But wine that just has a smell of vinegar but tastes like wine, Rabbi Yehuda holds that the bracha is a bar priagafen, while Rav Chisda says it's a shahakal. Amalei Abayil Rav Yosef. So ha Rabbi Yehuda, we have Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that it's a bar priagafen. Ha Rav Chisda, and we have Rav Chisda's opinion that it's a shahakal. Mar kaman svirle. Who does the master hold like? We're now pausing a moment to turn the channel.